And joining us now, great to welcome, a woman who's written another in her great series of thrillers. This one is called An Unwanted Guest. And, of course, you know her work from the previous bestsellers called The Couple Next Door. It was on the New York Times bestseller list for 23 consecutive weeks. And also A Stranger in the House. This one, again, called An Unwanted Guest. We're joined today by Shari Lapena on the telephone. Shari, good to talk with you. How are you?
I'm good, thank you.
Congratulations, first of all, on the previous two books. I know anytime a novelist sits down and puts that first blank screen on the computer, you always hope it's going to go well. But boy, 1 million copies—that's pretty good on the last book.
Yeah, you just never know. Every book's a new experiment, right?
That's it, yeah. But then the other one as well. So this one called An Unwanted Guest, and let's talk a little bit about. Again, I don't want to give away too much whenever I talk to novelists, but this is a thriller like the other two, and I know it takes place in a place not too far from where I grew up, at least in New York, anyway. The Catskills, right?
Yeah.
Give what you can about the plot.
Yeah. So it's about a bunch of strangers who all end up in the same lovely luxury hotel in the Catskills. It's a very remote location, and they all go up there for a weekend of rest and relaxation. But while they're up there, there's a terrible ice storm, and it cuts off all the electrical power and all communication with the outside world. And at the same time, they wake up the next morning and they find a dead body at the bottom of the grand staircase. And so although it looks at first like it's an accident, they soon start to wonder if it's murder. And then when a second body is discovered that has clearly been murdered, then they realize they've got a big problem. They're locked there with a killer, and they don't know who it is and who's going to be next. So that's the premise of the story.
That's where the fun begins.
Yeah.
Yeah, I always like those kind of stories where you have a bunch of people kind of in a, not trapped, but, in this sense, they're sort of trapped for a while with the weather.
Yeah.
So they all have to figure out, first of all, what's going on, second of all, surviving it, and then third of all, now you got a murder to deal with. So it adds a lot of dramatic tension, right?
Yeah. It's a sort of a classic setup that I wanted to give a try.
Well, now, again, the previous two books that were so successful, is it difficult? I know this is the third book, but is it difficult to kind of come up with something different, in each book now? Because plots are hard to come by, so it must be a challenge, right?
Well, the problem is plots are hard to come by because there's so much out there and so much has been done already. So it is hard to come up with something new. All you can really do is give your own new spin on it and tell the story in a way that no one else would tell it. It's they say there are no new stories, and it's very hard to come up with something completely unique. That is for sure.
Well, I know you've been,
but I think it's in how you tell the story and so on that makes it different.
Yeah, the style you have, which a lot of plot twists and that kind of thing. That's the challenge for any writer, to come up with things that the audience or reader doesn't expect. How do you go about that? Do you plot it out longhand? Just the full story, or how do you go about it?
No, I'm one of the non-planners. I find that I can't plan. I just sit there and I have a big. I've tried this before, where I have a big whiteboard and I try and plot out my whole novel, and I never can think of anything. I just sit there and I just can't think of anything. So what I do is I start with the premise, and I start with a character, and then I get into a bit, and then something happens, and that leads to something else, and that leads to something else, and then before I know it, I'm halfway in and I'm really enjoying it. So that's just the way my mind works. I can't plan it ahead because I just don't have the ideas until I'm working with the characters in the setting, in the story, and seeing what happens.
Is it tricky business when you write a mystery or a thriller like this to say you've written for a few days and you're 5 or 6 chapters in, to remember what you had in the first chapter so it makes sense, or do you have to keep going back, or how does that go? How does that work?
I'm pretty clear when I'm writing it. I'm pretty clear what's going on because I'm right in it. So I use multiple points of view, and I go deep into the point of view of various characters. And so when I'm in there, I know exactly what they're thinking. When I'm in someone else, I know what they're thinking. But I do, when it starts to get really complicated, when the book is longer, like getting towards the end, I will have to refer back and see, okay, where was that person at this time, and what did they see, and what did they hear, and did anyone see them watching, and so on. It was a tricky book to write, this one, for sure.
Do you know the killer? Well, actually, you kind of almost answered that. As you go along, it may change. So the killer may change as you're writing the book and say, well, this makes more sense than what I thought originally?
Yeah. Yeah, I actually don't go into it knowing who the killer will be.
Mm-hmm.
What I do is I try to set up stories, lines, so that there are several strands, and I develop each of those strands of story and character so that they might all be suspects, so they might all equally be the one at the end who does the murder.
Yeah.
But at some point at the end, I decide who the bad one is, who the real killer is. And then I've got all those strands there that were misrepresentations and red herrings and so on. But I have to do that so that the reader is swept along in thinking that any of these people could be the killer. So that's how I do it. And I make changes, of course. Like when I was writing this book, when I was 3/4 of the way through, I went back. When I finished it, after I finished the first draft, I think I took out a couple of characters. I added a character. And, of course, when you do that, it throws everything else off, and you have to go back and rewrite everything so that there's no flaws in it. So it's quite tricky doing that kind of a book.
Yeah, I guess the goal is of any book like this, you want the reader not to know the answer until the last page, right? You don't want them to figure it out in chapter 3. Then they won't read the rest, or may not read the rest, right?
Exactly. Yeah, you want them so engaged that they're constantly thinking, was it this one? Is it this one? Is this person going to die? And then, of course, as each person dies, you go, okay, it wasn't that one. I thought it was so-and-so, but, he's dead now, so, moving on.
Well, it's a great genre, like you said. I mean, in books, and, of course, all the television shows like Murder, She Wrote, Columbo, those people love that type of entertainment.
I love those, too.
That's great. Well, just kind of your background a little bit, I was interested as well. You worked 2 different jobs, right? You were a lawyer, then you were an English teacher before you started to write. So interesting 2 jobs you had. English teacher, high school?
Yes, high school English, yep.
So
I think what happened was, I always wanted to be a writer. And, when you're young and you think, I want to be a writer, everyone says, well, that's not very practical. So you look for a profession. So I became a lawyer just by default, I suppose. But I never really liked it. And I always wanted to be a writer. And, law didn't really suit me. I didn't enjoy it. And so I became an English teacher because I really do like, reading and books and writing and talking about it. I like to teach. So that was a good fit. But then I stayed home when my first child was born. And then I decided to stay home for a few years, and that's when I actually had the time to start writing seriously. And that's really when I came back to what was my childhood dream of being a writer in the first place. Yeah. So it sort of came full circle, but I really just wanted to be a writer.
How difficult was it, when you wrote the first book to get it published? That always seems to be the first hurdle you have to overcome, get one published, right?
Well, I wrote a couple of literary comedies first. So I wrote comedy, and I had no trouble getting an agent, getting those published in Canada. And then I switched to thrillers, and that's when it became super quick and easy. Like I sent The Couple Next Door out to an agent, and she took me on the next day. And within 6 weeks, she'd sold it in a preempt, and there were like 30 countries buying it.
Oh, wow.
And it happened really fast. So I can't say, like, on the one hand, I mean, it looks like an overnight success because I had such great luck with my first thriller. But on the other hand, I'd been writing for 16 years, very, very disciplined, religiously writing for 16 years before I had written that book and got anywhere. So a lot of hard work and discipline goes into learning the craft before you get your big break. But still, I was very lucky that Couple did what it did.
Hey, you were ready when it happened. So
I was ready.
That came from the 16 years of work, right?
Yeah. I mean, and now it's been another 3 years. I've been in 18, 19 years now. I've been writing what I consider full-time. And yes, I'm successful, but there was many, many years there where I was writing every day when I didn't have a publisher or an agent. Or, people who want to write end up writing, and they write for a long time before they ever have an agent or before they ever have a contract. So writers just write. That's what they do, and I always did, even when I didn't have anyone to write for. It's different now, of course. It's fantastic. I have a contract, and I write a book every year, and I have readers, and it's fantastic. But it takes a while to get there. It's not an overnight thing.
Well, this book, again, called An Unwanted Guest, and we've been talking with Shari Lapena today. Shari, give out your website again for people that may not have it so they can get more information on the book.
Yeah, it's www.sharilapena.com.
That's L-A-P-E-N-A is the spelling of the last name. Shari, pleasure talking to you.
Yep.
I assume you're working on another book, so we'll hopefully talk to you when that comes out. But thanks for being with us.
Okay. Talk to you next August.
Thank you. Bye.
All right. Thank you very much.